Welcome to the Restless Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. And Rory, I'm going to start with Liam Moran. Did anyone pick up on the fact that Rory did not say that he was rereading Alastair's diaries last week? Now, as you know, Conservatives never read books, they reread books. But you did say you were reading. So is that the first time you've looked at my diaries?
No, it's not. No, I've mentioned them. As assiduous listeners to the podcast will have picked up, I mention your diaries quite a lot. I think that actually we should use them more. I think they're really fascinating because they're a wonderful way of getting comparisons with new governments coming in. And it's exactly what allows me to say, wait a sec, this is where you were at this stage of the government. Otherwise, we lose all comparatives.
Yeah, I'm thinking that when we open our tour, the Restless Politics tour, which the first event is going to be in Brighton, I wonder whether we shouldn't get you to read out the bit where Peter Mandelson and I get into a punch-up over whether Tony should wear a tie.
That's good.
It's one of the most embarrassing. But I'm all for the embarrassing bits being read out.
Paul James, just connecting with what you just said, I'm looking forward to attending the Restless Politics Live at Birmingham a couple of weeks' time. However, I'm a little disappointed that Anthony Scaramucci and Katty Kay are not going to be at the Birmingham event. My question to Rory and Alastair, have they considered having Anthony and Katty attend as holograms, akin to the ABBA Voyage live shows? Joking aside, really looking forward to the show. We could also, of course, famously get Narendra Modi turning up as a hologram. He has lots of holograms, doesn't he?
Well, that was when I first was aware of the hologram as a political device. I think I'm right in saying that the overall cost of the ABBA Voyage is, when you take into account all the technology and all the sort of bits that go with it, it's something like £1 million a minute, something like that. I mean,
oh wow,
I could be way off. So I don't know how much you're hoping to make from this tour, Rory, but that's one very good way of making sure you make absolutely nothing.
That might reduce by £1 million a minute.
And by the way, I think I'm right in saying that Birmingham is where we're the only one of these venues where, you know, there's still quite a few tickets to go. So come on, Birmingham, wake up.
Which makes me incredibly bitter because we went to Birmingham because everybody from Birmingham said we hadn't included
come to Birmingham.
Yeah, I know.
Exactly, yeah. Maybe all those Tories are at the conference in Birmingham now. Now, Roy, let me ask you this one. Georgia Mallory, if I was a Tory, brackets I'm not, who should I vote for in the Tory leadership election?
Well, we're going to do a lot more about this on the live tour, says he, continuing to plug, and reassuring people that actually there's a lot of exclusive fun when you see us sitting there like boxers in the ring of the O2. So we will do a lot more on the Tory leadership and keep quite a lot of that exclusive. I guess I'm between Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly. And inevitably, being me, it looks like neither of them might make it through to the last two.
I think there's quite a lot of shenanigans going on to stop Kemi Badenoch making her way through. I watched, call me sad, Rory, but I watched Trevor Phillips' show yesterday because I knew that all the four candidates were going to be on. If I had to give a very brief summary, I thought James Cleverly, I'm afraid, was a bit lame. He came over more as a sort of commentator than a politician. I thought Tom Tugendhat, who I've gone off because of his ridiculous stance on the ECHR, I nonetheless thought he spoke very, very well and he had a sort of sense of a message. I think the thing about Kemi Badenoch is she's very good at creating noise and headlines and drama, but I didn't leave it any clear about what she really fundamentally stood for. And then generic, I just find Ian Dale, funny enough, was on the panel and he said afterwards, he and Katie Balls and Andy Street, they were all basically saying that they didn't know whether this journey that Jenrick had been on from being a sort of Cameroonian to this sort of sub-Farage figure that he's trying to become, they couldn't quite work out where the real Jenrick was. So all in all, pretty uninspiring, I have to say.
We will get into that. We'll get into that and we'll talk about Tory leadership contests.
Right, Rory. Your friend Eric Adams, the New York mayor, has got himself into more trouble, more headlines, and we've got a question from Linda Johnson. Eric Adams has told the public to withhold judgment until he's made his defence, pleading not guilty. I'd like to hear your views.
Eric Adams, this is a big story and probably something worth spending a little bit of time on. So this is the mayor of New York. And we discussed it a couple of weeks ago when the beginnings of allegations were coming, police commissioners resigning, allegations against friends and aides of him. But now finally we've had the big case and he's going to be arraigned. And he's refusing to resign. He's saying he's going to keep doing his job, but he's accused of corruption. And actually it's an interesting type of corruption because it's not a million miles away from some of the stuff that we've had in Britain. Basically, what he seems to have done is he's accepted freebies. He's accepted plane flights and upgrades on planes and he's accepted hotel rooms. But the problem is that he took those things from Turkish Airlines, partly because there's a big Turkish community in Brooklyn where he was the borough president before he was mayor. Then his phone, which has been seized, they found in text messages that when the Turks wanted to open a 32-story consulate in time for Erdogan's visit to New York, and it had been blocked by the New York Fire Department that said it had failed more than a dozen different sort of fire regulations. Eric Adams was contacted by the Turkish consulate that said, we've done a lot for you in the past. Could you please help us with the consulate? And he said, sure, I'll get onto it. Sorted it out and put pressure on the fire department. And he then gets a text from the Turkish consulate saying, you are a great friend of Turkey. And Eric Adams writes back cheerfully saying, more than that, I'm a great friend of you anytime. Happy to help. So anyway, it's interesting. I mean, and the whole thing amounts to about $100,000. So it's not quite some of these American scandals where senators are sticking gold bars under their beds. It's more freebies and favors, isn't it?
Yeah, I think where I would think you were being a bit harsh and a bit unfair to Labour is that what he's ended up being charged with relates straightforwardly to bribery and also fraud charges related to the manner in which he solicited some of these. So listen, it's a terrible story for him. He's fighting it. I mean, there's no. He was pretty Trumpian in his fight against it,
and it's not a great look because it means that we have a Democratic politician, right, from the Democratic Party, who's now been indicted, refusing to step down at the time at which it's a very important part of the Democratic campaign against Trump to say this is an indicted felon and he's a convicted felon, actually, in the case of Trump.
Yeah.
And nobody really knows what happens if he doesn't step down and he actually appears in court because the governor won't fire him.
The governor could just say, sorry, you've got to go.
She's reluctant to do it. He's quite a character. He was a big party guy. And he's also plays a bit fast and loose with the truth. It seems as though he may not have actually lived in New York, but instead lived with his partner in New Jersey and sort of faked up an apartment in New York to make it look like he was eligible to stand. And then a New York Times journalist, he'd always talked about the fact that he carried in his wallet a picture of an NYPD police officer. He used to be a police officer who was killed and it meant so much to him. He had it carried over in his wallet. And this journalist said, can I see the photograph? So she was invited over to the mayor's office and she was given this photograph from his wallet. But it later turned out that Eric Adams's team had taken it off the internet and then dropped tea on it to make it look older, to fake it as being in his wallet. So there's I don't know. I mean, these are not big things, but there's a sort of a bit of a pattern going on here.
Yeah, just so that you understand, though, the wire fraud count that he's charged with carries a maximum sentence of 20 years. The soliciting campaign contributions from foreign nationals, you can get, and he's got 2 counts of those, they can get 5 years each. The bribery charge, maximum charge, 10 years. And the conspiracy to commit wire fraud, federal program bribery, and receiving campaign contribution by foreign nationals, maximum 5 years. So you top those up. I'm not suggesting that either that he's guilty, because I don't know, or that he's going to go to jail. But in their system, this is what's so amazing about watching what Trump gets up to.
Yeah.
And thinking, how does he get away? Did you see, by the way,
sorry, just quickly on this, I wonder whether we might not be getting to a stage in the States and in Britain and elsewhere where we just make a very clear rule that you just can't take flights, you can't take upgrades, you can't take anything. And if you're a government minister, the government can jolly well pay for those things if you want to go and see a show.
But what about if you're an MP? Let's say you're a Rory Stewart style MP who doesn't like freebies and just takes things very, very seriously. And let's say that you are on a select committee and a government offers to take you out to take a look at their country.
I refused, actually. I refused.
Did you?
I refused. My colleagues all did it, but I never did that. I hated it. I mean, Conservative Friends of Israel would do it. Conservative Friends of the Middle East would do it. Azerbaijan would do it. I mean, they were always paying for MPs to visit their countries. But the problem is that if you take that money, you go on a tour organized by their governments showing you the most kind of crazy propaganda. No, I think it would be much more straightforward if we just banned it. And then the MPs could start putting pressure on Parliament or the government to say it's important for us to do this. So give us a budget to do it. Or,
Mm,
as education secretary, for some reason, I've got to go to this show. So could the government pay for me to go to the show? Because I
mm.
just think otherwise you just get in a mess.
Yeah. But I also think if you think about opposition, when you're in opposition, I think I've just had a meeting today with Chris Hipkins, who we interviewed on Leading, who was the former New Zealand Prime Minister, now
Yeah.
back in
Yeah.
opposition.
Yeah.
And we were just talking about, how in opposition, at least you do have a bit of time to think and
Yeah.
to travel and to.
Yeah.
I just think if you have an absolute hard rule, nobody can take anything from anyone. I
Yeah.
think I don't know. I think it's tricky.
I just wonder whether it might. I know it sounds a bit extreme, but I wonder whether it wouldn't drive change. Whether
Yeah,
if you
possibly.
really
Yeah.
made it harder, then people would provide the budgets.
Yeah. Now, Rory, as you know, we have a lot of MPs who listen to us. John Slinger, who is the MP for Rugby, Labour MP. Do you agree with me that the gambling industry is pernicious, given that it targets young people through sports advertising and mobile phone apps? Do you agree that we need to get gambling ads out of football and all sport, given the harm caused?
Blimey. I mean, I don't know enough about this. My instinct is yes, but you're much more of a guy who understands sport.
I think he's got a real point here. I mean, just to give you an example, some of the people who present football on Sky and Sky Sport, listen, I'd find it very hard to live without Sky Sport. Okay, it's quite a big part of my life, but I think when some of the presenters are also presenting adverts for Sky's betting business, I just think that is all wrong. And I don't know the numbers now, but I asked you to do this, Roy. I mean, I don't ask you to do much. Just watch one episode of Match of the Day and
Yeah.
watch an episode where all 20 teams are on there and
Yeah.
count for me how many of the shirts have betting companies on them and how much of the perimeter advertising is gambling. Now, the point is, they will say, oh, well, but people can make a judgment and, but the fact is, they don't do it other than by knowing that they're getting people into gambling and it's addictive.
Yeah. So, Alistair, one for you from Dom Lee. With Sue Gray hitting the headlines. So, Sue Gray is the new chief of staff in Downing Street. What does Alistair remember about when he first became the story, and any reflections on the infamous Channel 4 interview? So, in context for listeners, I reckon almost everybody will know this, but Alistair was Tony Blair's communications director, but very, very rapidly became a very central part of the story and appeared in photographs and cartoons, and people wrote about him probably more than they wrote about, definitely more than they wrote about many cabinet ministers. How do you think that happened, and what's this infamous Channel 4 interview?
So the Channel 4 interview, this was at the height of my row with the BBC over Iraq. Richard Sambrook, I think it was the head of news, put out an absolutely disingenuous reply to a complaint that I'd made. And I then phoned John Reid, who was one of our absolute safe pair of hands, and said, John, are you able to go on the telly and sort of take this nonsense apart? And I'll brief you on the way. He said, yeah, absolutely, no problem. Meanwhile, Channel 4 had asked me to go on. As you know, didn't do interviews, despite being the story. And I just felt that this was the point at which this Iraq story had got so, and the row with the BBC had got so kind of dominant in the media, so sort of, and I was absolutely central to it. So I thought maybe I should do it myself.
So up to that point, you'd not been doing interviews, and suddenly you decide to do a Channel 4 interview.
Yeah, correct. Now, first of all, I spoke to my boss, Tony Blair. What do you think? I spoke to one or two other people. And Tony said, yeah, on balance, yeah, okay, but make sure you stay calm. Anyway, I recommend that you Google the interview. I actually think it's one of those interviews where when I listened back to it, which I did when I was preparing for the Iraq inquiry, and also I get lots of students send it to me to sort of say, I'm writing an essay about this and what should I say? And I actually I stand by every single word that I said.
Yes. What would a critic say, Alistair? What would somebody who was less well disposed towards you say about this interview?
Well, Fiona Miller, for example, my partner, she would say that it was a ridiculous thing to do. I should have stayed out of it. But I had a pen in my hand, and John Stowe was during the interview. And so I was doing my hand gestures, but it did look like I was sort of on the point of stabbing him. So, yeah, I still think it was the right thing to do, because I'll tell you why. Because there comes a point in some of these stories when you just think, fuck it. I've got to show the public what is going on here. And I think actually I exposed it perfectly well. Anyway, that was that. What do you do when you become the story? You probably don't go on television. um, and how did it happen to me? It's very different to what's happened to Sue Gray, because with me, you have to remember, I was seeing the media all the time. They were utterly obsessed with our media operation, this whole spin thing that sort of
And
became.
where did it come from? Because Margaret Thatcher had Bernard Ingham, hadn't she? So it wasn't a new thing that people had people trying to
Well,
do
Harold
press and
Wilson had
comms.
Joe Haynes, and I don't know really. Maybe it was because I was a former journalist. Maybe it was because I'd come from a place of being absolutely clear with the media. I was not going to take a backward step, that we were determined to set the agenda and so forth. But, and also, I mean, Andrew Ronsdale once, the Observer, once saying to me, he says, the trouble is that most of the media find you more interesting than most of the politicians. But it was also the fact that I was there in their face every day. So they saw more of me than anybody else.
You did the lobby briefings, so
I
they
did,
came to you
yeah.
at number 10, yeah.
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 Now, normally that would, and by the way, I started to become the story in opposition. I remember the very, very first, when we won the election, either the first day or the second day, the Independent, which, not a paper totally hostile to us, but the front page was a picture of me, Sally Morgan, and Jonathan Powell. And it was basically saying, it was essentially saying, these are the people in charge now, sort of thing.
Right.
And I think part of the thing was that people wanted to sort of project Tony as being not wholly in charge and having these other people around him. And I was this sort of black arts person. So was Peter Mandelson. But I just think it was a nonsense. But the thing with Sue Gray is different, because Sue Gray was a long-serving civil servant who absolutely hated being in the public eye at the time of the Boris Johnson, and I think felt that the government really treated her badly, the Tory government, in saying, right, Sue Gray is going to decide what's the rights and wrongs of this. And you remember how we had that wait for Sue Gray,
Yeah.
wait for Sue
Yeah.
Gray,
Yeah.
wait for Sue
Exactly.
Gray.
Yeah. Yeah.
She then goes and decides to leave the civil service, go and work for Labour, and is now back in, and I think has been, done in by quite a few people. Some in the civil service, some maybe in the Labour Party. But this point about becoming the story, I was at an event the other day at BAFTA with some business people, and Sue Gray was mentioned. And I said, well, first of all, let me check with the public, with the audience. Does anybody here not know who Sue Gray is? And not a single hand went up.
So everybody had heard of her.
Everybody had heard of her. I then sort of said, well, has everybody here heard of Morgan McSweeney? Quite a lot of hands went up. Has anybody
Right.
here heard of Matthew Doyle, who's the press guy?
Yeah.
A lot of hands went up.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt that Sue Gray has become a very, very, very well known, probably not recognized. People don't necessarily know what she looks like because she's talked about rather than she's not on the telly.
But better known than people like Morgan Sweeney and Matthew Dodd.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course that is difficult. But I think I've said to you before that with Tony, his view was that even though I was attracting all this stuff, one, I was doing it partly as a lightning conductor for him. Two, he understood that they were doing it as a way of undermining him. And as long as I had his trust and confidence, there wasn't a problem there. But it's not pleasant. It's really not pleasant. And I think I was ready for it. I knew that it was going to happen to some extent. I mean, the day I was announced in 1994, from day one, there were stories that started to appear. I can remember I told Tony all the skeletons in my cupboard. And I suppose, there was the drink, there was bouts of violence from time to time. There was the whole thing about...
You'd been hospitalized.
I'd been hospitalized for a breakdown. There was all that stuff. There was stories I'd written, writing for sex magazines. So all this stuff, right? So I remember sitting around after I'd started the job thinking, right, I wonder, talking to my team and saying, I wonder when they'll do this story, when they'll do this story. News of the World did the lot first weekend. So it was, but I think you become the political story when within the political world, people start to think that you're a problem. Now, I don't know, some people will defend Sue Gray to the hilt, others will say this is difficult and whatever. But it's not pleasant, and it will be particularly unpleasant for her because by background, she's a civil servant. She doesn't want to be in the public eye.
Right. Let's move you on to international. Fatin Sharif. Brandenburg election results show that AfD has outperformed remarkably well with 16 to 24-year-old voters
Yeah.
compared to others. There's growing data from around the world that younger voters, men in particular, are voting for these parties without citing immigration as the top issue for their vote. What do you think's happening here? Is this mainly an anti-establishment reaction to the current economic situation, or is this a never seen before in decades cultural event?
Well, I think it's a great question. I think it's very interesting. I said in my last book, What Can I Do? I wrote about this survey that had been done, where in every continent in the world now, the decile of the population most open to the idea of military and authoritarian rule is not the old, it's the young, and it's young men. And we're seeing this in Trump in America, where young men, by and large, broadly in favor of Trump, young women massively in favor of Kamala Harris. I think I think part of it is this whole thing about masculinity. I think the way that Andrew Tate has become this sort of, quite influential figure for a lot of young men and in schools. I think pornography has had an impact.
And obviously, one of the things, I mean, an older woman said to me recently that she felt, I mean, she's admittedly in her 80s, but she felt that society was becoming more feminized, that the values, the dominant values of culture were values that she, as a woman in her 80s, saw as more feminine values. And she said there were more female teachers in schools, more female doctors, and that increasingly the way that men in their late teens behave is seen as being sort of unacceptable, and that they don't really feel they have space to be themselves. But maybe you don't buy into that.
Well, I buy into it partly, but only I think as an excuse. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having lots of female teachers. There's nothing wrong with having lots of female doctors. I feel that there is a thing I think about young men trying to work out what young men are for. And I'm not saying they sit around thinking about it all the time, but if you go back to, say when I was growing up, there was the role of men was kind of clearer. You were the person who worked, you were the person who fathered children, and then you went off and you carried on working, and it was all quite sort of pretty straightforward. I think now women are a lot of women not wanting to have children till a lot later. Quite a lot of women actually not wanting to have children at all. Uh, a lot of young men who I think worry that their career paths are less certain than they were. Now, it's the same for women. It's just that the women are now competing with the men. And maybe it is just a sort of a desire to, I think, to maybe reimpose some of the inequalities that most developed countries have actually got rid of. And I think that's being politicized and being exploited. I mentioned Tate. I think Farage does it to some extent.
And I guess Kickel in Austria, I mean, he's got this extraordinary thing in the last podcast that you quoted where he talks about head teachers and part of this sort of huge
Yeah.
rant of various hate figures.
And this thing about, he talks about drag queens as though drag queens have got some sort of power. So I think this is where it's been exploited, weaponized, toxified.
And meanwhile, young women are more progressive and left-wing than they were historically. So there's been a real sort of gender bifurcation, hasn't there? I mean, politics used to be this generational split, didn't it? You were meant to be left-wing when you were young and right-wing when you were old. But now increasingly it's gendered.
Well, I hope it doesn't stay that way, because that's just going to further polarize, isn't it?
It's unbelievable in the US election. If you look at Pennsylvania, I think Trump is leading by a very long way among young men, and Kamala Harris is leading by a very long way among young women. I mean, something like 15, 18 points in some of the polls. I mean, chalk and cheese.
Yeah. Actually, talking of Trump, Rory, we've got a question here from Rom Somia. Would you be prepared to have Donald Trump on the podcast? How would you deal with him? Would you be concerned about giving him publicity? Well, I don't think there's anybody. He gets publicity, whatever he does. Where would you draw the line? Would you do Putin, Farage?
Yeah, no. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's very weird. We can see obviously what the problem is if you're too soft on politicians. If you let monsters get away with things, in fact, famously, people did polite interviews with Adolf Hitler and didn't challenge him. On the other hand, you've got Aaron Clayton asking us a question saying, do you think the way in which the media currently interviews politicians is up to standard? UK media love asking questions, then interrupting the politicians rather than letting them answer. The interviewers always pushing for that gotcha moment. And I think there sometimes, I mean, it's a bit like when I remember when I first interviewed you, when I first interviewed Tony Blair, there's a sort of rather kind of maybe boring is a bit unfair, but very, very predictable view that, we have to pin you down and ask you solemn questions about Iraq, despite the
Mm.
fact that we know that you've been asked those questions 300 times before. I'm not going to get anything new out of Tony Blair. It's just going to put his back up.
I think 300 is a very, very low end estimate of. I think once you
but,
put a
but, but,
couple of
but, but,
noughts
but,
on it.
but you know what I mean? That somehow every journalist going into that interview feels it's their moral obligation.
To be fair to you, I remember that interview we did at your house, and to be fair to you, you basically said you were most interested in how the decision was made to go to war in Iraq. So it wasn't as if I wasn't expecting lots of questions about Iraq. No, the ones that really annoy me are when you're doing an interview where they'll talk about this, that, and the other, and they say, and obviously I have to ask you about Iraq. Well, the obviously means I'm worried that what other journalists will think if I don't ask you about Iraq. But as you say, there's no question I haven't been asked, and there's no answer that I'm likely to give that I haven't given many, many times before.
Well, we had an interesting one, didn't we, with Kwasi Kwarteng, where we were criticized by somebody who I admire a great deal on Twitter, Henry Porter, who said
Mm.
that we'd been too soft on him. And I actually thought that two-part interview gave him space to talk and got much more out of him.
I think that's right.
But I do think there is. But that was your judgment. You were correct on getting him on. I was reluctant to interview Kwasi
Yeah.
Kwarteng because I had such a negative view about that. I thought I'm going to find this very difficult to do a decent interview. And I definitely think that I'm a bit worried about what would happen if we did interview Trump or Farage or even Liz Truss, to be honest, because i I don't know how you'd actually bring out their character, bring out their stories, bring out their life, because you wouldn't really be able to get past trying to land what you thought was wrong with them.
Look, I wouldn't have any worries about being able to do a proper interview with Nigel Farage. I think this the differences between, by and large, you and I, when we're interviewing people, we tend not to interrupt. And we give people time, we give people space. And I think it's about asking very, very direct questions in a sort of clear, fair, consistent way. So, for example, if Donald Trump said something that was blatantly untrue, I think I, for one, would just say, can we just go back to what you just said about such and such? That's not true. Why do you think that it's okay to lie in the way that you do? Now, he would then argue that it wasn't a lie and he'd go on to something else. And then I think I'd just keep coming back like that. But also, I think you try with somebody like him you talk about sort of getting his story. I think there are all sorts of things in his past that aren't actually really covered that much. I'd be fascinated. Do you know this story about, I think I've told you before about this. I'm fascinated by the fact that if it wasn't for the sinking of a boat in the Hebrides, he would never even have been born because, because his mother left because this boat sank, killing lots of young men. And because there were so few young men after the war, that's why she went to America.
It's a sort of Alastair Campbell connection, isn't it? You've both got connections to
The Hebrides.
Gaelic-speaking Hebrides, yeah.
Exactly. There's another one here on Trump. Andrew, I accept there was a realpolitik aspect to Starmer's recent meeting with Trump, but I wonder what the real-world consequences would be for the UK if he, Keir Starmer, decided not to indulge the petulant narcissism of a re-elected Trump. How damaging would it be and how would it play out? This is somebody who's obviously seen Love Actually, where Hugh Grant as the president sort of, dances around number 10 and basically slags off the American president like nobody's business.
Which, of course, was the fantasy of many, many people that
Absolutely.
They wanted Tony Blair to do
Exactly.
to George W. Bush.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think a lot of Labour supporters and members of the public as well would have felt uncomfortable about Keir Starmer seeing Donald Trump. But I think it was realpolitik. I mean, if the guy becomes president, the chances of actually forming a proper, sensible, grown-up relationship aren't very strong. But I think you have to try. I think Theresa May tried, and I think she was right to. I mean, and all that people remember was him grabbing her by the hand and then at Chequers kind of dominating and talking over at a press conference. That's all people remember of that relationship. But ultimately, I think you do have to try. So no, I think as own goals go, I think actually deciding that Trump is a petulant narcissist and treating him like that would be bigger than free box at Arsenal as own goals go, I'd say.
It was fascinating that Trump's big thing after the interview was to say how incredibly popular Keir Starmer was.
No, he said that before the meeting. That was what was funny about it. I've not heard anything after the meeting. He did say he's very, very popular. He's a nice guy and he's very, very popular.
Daniel McManus, I happened to listen to David Davis' episode today, that this interview we did on leading
Yeah.
Conservative politician. Really felt sorry for him. He's so clear at the start that logical consistency is at the heart of his beliefs. Then he goes on to tie himself in knots because he seems afraid. Can each of you think of an example when you were proven wrong? What were your emotions and how did you manage through it intellectually? So I've been wrong in a lot of things. I initially supported the Iraq War, and then I got onto the ground in Iraq and decided it was an horrible mess and a disaster and we shouldn't be there. I think as a politician, it's particularly tricky because even though, we are wrong about lots of things, have to be wrong about lots of things. I mean, we don't really get the future. We can't really predict the future. But boy, your opponents like to use it. If you admit that you were wrong on something and say, why should I ever trust you in the future if you got your judgment wrong on that? I'm trying to think. Maybe, I mean, it's just a harsh thing to say, but I tell you one thing I was wrong on. I liked Theresa May so much as a person and was so impressed by the warm reaction that we were getting in a by-election in Cumbria in 2017 that I was one of the people that thought that her triggering the election in 2017 would go well, and of course it went terribly badly. That was very poor political judgment on my part. Yeah.
The thing that pops into my head, and this will infuriate many of the sort of Iraq haters who might listen, but when you said that question, the first thing that popped into my head was actually this is going to sound quite weird, but it was about how the fact that I sort of couldn't really see the internet taking off in a way that was going to affect my life very much. So I remember a guy called Nick Assender who he worked in the lobby, and he worked on one of the papers, and he came to see me and he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm leaving. I'm going to the BBC." Oh, I said, "That's interesting." Yeah, I'm doing all the kind of online news reporting. And I was saying, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I'm with the sort of internet thing. I'm going to be like doing our website and all that stuff and the news on the website." I said, "That's no, what do you do that for? You stay in papers, mate. Stay in papers." So I think I underestimated the technological revolution.
There was actually an interesting coming together there, wasn't there? Because David Davis revealed to us that he wanted to buy the Mirror and make you the editor. He wanted actually
Absolutely. Yeah.
that both of you were going to bet heavy on the
By the way,
print media. Yeah.
that question about David Davis, I think underlines what you said earlier. I think he did slightly tie himself in knots, and he didn't tie himself in knots by us tying him in knots. He tied himself in knots by us just coming back with questions that, lent into his ability to tie himself in knots, and I think he did.
I also think that he, and to some extent Rachel Reeves, are an example of the fact that getting aggressive with the interviewer is never good. I mean, and I've always been struck by this. I remember William Hague coming in to testify when I was on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and he was just so charming and unflappable and never ever lost his temper with us. And as a result, he was able to waltz through these hearings. I basically learnt that if you're polite to a select committee, they basically can't touch you. As soon as you start saying, Rachel Reeves was like, "I'm not having that coming from a Tory," or, or David Davis saying, "You're the establishment," then suddenly.
It's funny, going back to the Channel 4 thing, around the same time, I did lose my temper at a select committee. Not lose my temper, but I got very, very, very angry and agitated. And the clip that made it on the news, we should probably dig it out. And I basically I was punching the table and I was saying, and I will not stop banging on about this until the BBC acknowledged they've made a mistake, apologise, and da 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 da. And I'm sure Fiona wouldn't agree, but I thought it was a pretty effective piece of communication. I think sometimes temper's okay.
Yeah, it depends what you're trying to do. But if your objective is to make it through an interview without riling the other person, then disarming with charm is.
Don't get me wrong, charm is definitely worth having. Here's one that I'm very keen to do. I'm afraid I'll have to mention Fiona again. Anne McCarthy. Did either of you ever meet Maggie Smith? I met Maggie Smith.
Go on, tell us your Maggie Smith story. Maybe we'll finish with your Maggie Smith story.
The reason I met Maggie Smith is because her secretary was a guy called Christopher Downs, who was the partner of Ilted Harrington, There's a political angle here. He was the former chair of the GLC.
There's the Greater London Council of People. He's like an early sort of mayor of London type.
Exactly. And Chris just had these wonderful stories about Maggie Smith, because he was her secretary, he was her kind of confidant, he used to be her dresser, he just looked after her. And the sense you got of her was just of somebody who was quite highly strung, incredibly witty, very spiky. Fiona actually spoke at Chris's funeral, and Maggie arrived after the funeral had already started. So the funeral was already underway and the church doors open and Maggie's there. And Chris would have absolutely loved the fact that even at his funeral, she stole the show.
I was at the National Theatre and watching a play called Coriolanus, which for political geeks is a great thing to go and see if you're interested in politics and compromise. And the director of the National Theatre appeared on stage, Rufus Norris, because it was the day that Maggie Smith had died. And I was really struck by the professionalism and the pride of Rufus Norris in the National Theatre there. 7:30 at night, could have been at home. He turned up just in order to walk on that stage and say, I'd like all of us to remember Maggie Smith tonight.
Oh.
She was an amazing institution. And I just thought there was something really cheered me up about Britain, cheered me up about institutions, cheered me up about his professionalism and the sense of people's legacy. So, yeah, Maggie Smith.
Well, I think that's a lovely story, and I think that's a good place to end, just remembering the wonderful Maggie Smith. See you soon.
See you soon.